Chapter 30, Lesson 5. World War II ends. By 1943, the Allies had strengthened their strategies and stopped the advances of both the Germans and the Japanese. Germany surrendered on May 7, 1945, and Japan surrendered on August 14th of 1945, about 3 months later. When the war ended, political tensions, suspicions, and conflicts of ideas led to a new struggle, the Cold War, which Cold War will be our next unit. So the Axis powers, Germany and Japan, had been really successful in the beginning of the war. From 1939 when the war started, the United States gets involved in 1941, and the tide of the war starts to change in 1943. The Axis powers surrendered in Tunisia, which made it possible for the Allies to cross the Mediterranean Sea and begin an invasion of Italy. In this map, you can see how close Tunisia in North Africa is to Italy. Go ahead and pause here if you need to finish these notes. So the Allies invade Italy, and after the island of Sicily fell to the Allies, King Victor Emmanuel III had Mussolini arrested. The Nazis pulled off a really amazing covert operation where they were able to break him out of prison and bring him safely to northern Italy, where he was made head of a German puppet state in northern Italy, and German troops came in and had control of most of Italy. However, the Allies were able to sack Rome on June 4th of 1944. Go ahead and pause here if you need to finish these notes. Alright, so the Allies had been planning for a way to invade France from the English Channel since the fall of 1943. They had thought about it and they had wanted to do it since Dunkirk, but now they've been planning it once the Soviet Union and the United States and Britain all sat down, and when they made that agreement for unconditional surrender, they realize they want to invade France from crossing the Channel, but as we've talked about before, and as we saw back in World War I with Gallipoli, it's really hard to take someone's beach. Amphibious landings are incredibly difficult. So several years of planning went into what is now known as D-Day. On June 6th, the Allied forces under General Dwight D. Eisenhower landed on the beaches of Normandy, France. The night before, the airplanes flew over, and they actually dropped paratroopers behind enemy forces in the middle of the night. So these men, I can't even imagine how scary that would be, to jump out of a plane with your parachute, land somewhere in occupied France, and then you've got to figure out where you are. It's nighttime, it's dark. They had strategic bridges and places that they needed to sneakily take over and wait for the morning for the invasion to start on the beaches. This is history's greatest naval invasion. This invasion ends up lasting 3 months. It starts in June. It took them 3 months to fully to reach Paris. The troops were able to fight their way past underwater mines, barbed wire, machine guns. They nicknamed the beaches. There was 5 different nicknames. So the Brits and the Canadians were able to take over the codename beach Gold, Juno, and Sword pretty easily. Now the Americans, they had 2 beaches. The one codenamed Utah they were able to take over fairly easily. However, there was heavy German resistance at the beach that was called Omaha. Several thousand troops died there. It was not an easy battle on the beaches of Omaha. Um, However, the Germans thought that the attack was going to happen somewhere else. The Allies had spent years creating kind of fake diversions. They used spies, they did fake radio transmitters. So the Germans had thought for a long time the real attack was going to happen somewhere else in France or somewhere else in Norway. So they really didn't respond very quickly because they thought this was just a trick. So they held back because they thought it was a trick that if they sent all their forces to Normandy, that then the real attack was going to happen somewhere else. They thought this was a trick. So they didn't respond very quickly. Also, their leader was away on a leave of absence. Not Himmler, I was mixing up with Himmler. Rommel. Rommel was away on a leave of absence, and no one could get Hitler on the phone because he was sleeping in. Um, so there also this slow reaction allowed the Allied powers to take over these beaches. I really wish there was enough I could say to give honor and justice and diligence to what happened on these beaches in Normandy. If you ever have time to watch the opening scene of Saving Private Ryan, it's really amazing what they were able to accomplish. One of the things I find the most fascinating is I put a picture down here. They were called mulberry harbors. It's basically a way that I mean, D-Day was just such an amazing feat of engineering. You know, they got tanks to float onto beaches. This is another thing they did by creating a mulberry harbor. It's basically a temporary harbor, temporary piers by sinking ships in concrete and being able to build roads on top of them because from previous mistakes they've made in the past, they realized they need a harbor, they need a port. So they were able to just essentially build temporary harbors and ports to get, so this is, because if you think about it, how are you supposed to get tanks and trucks onto a beach and everything else that your troops need? You can't just leave the men out there by themselves. They need support. Um, so like I said, they spent years planning these amazing feats of engineering of how to have an amphibious landing and free France from occupied Germany. Go ahead and pause here if you need more time to go over your notes or to take the notes. So 3 months after they landed on those beaches in Normandy, France, they were able to take over Paris by August of 1944. The Germans did launch a counterattack. They did fight back. This was their last hurrah, if you will. This was called the Battle of the Bulge. It's called the Bulge because if you were to look at a map and see where the Allied line was, their military, their troops were in a straight line. This German counterattack created a bulge in their line where Germany had took some of the land back. Both sides suffered major heavy losses, but the Allies were not going to be stopped. So we've got, if you look at the map, the Allied powers are in blue. So on the west, you've got Britain, United States, and France. And then over on the east, you've got the Soviets. The Allies crossed the Rhine and entered into German territory in 1945. They were able to close in on Germany and met up with the Soviet army by April of 1945. The Soviets, man, they really crushed it on the east side. They are a force to be reckoned with. And because of the Cold War situation, we don't talk about them enough and their contributions enough, and we don't give them their due diligence often enough. But the Allies would not have won World War II without the help of the Soviets. Because you see, we've got 3 countries on the west side, 1 country on the east side, just doing serious damage. They actually see most of those concentration camps and the death camps were in Poland over here. Poland is over here in the east. So the Soviets actually discovered most of the camps and liberated a lot of the Jews. So Hitler is being sandwiched from both sides. Mussolini was shot and killed by Italian partisans. That's one of your vocab words. Partisans were resistance fighters. They were not in on being fascists. They were not part of the black shirts. They wanted to stay true to the king and true to Italy. Mussolini was shot and killed, and he was hung. After he was killed, he was hung upside down in the town square for everyone to see his dead body. Hitler hid in a bunker that was about 50 feet below the city of Berlin. Some of his final words were, of course, blaming the Jews for this loss, and he ended up committing suicide, like the coward he is, in a bunker just before the Allies closed in on Berlin. You can see Berlin is right here in the middle. And in this picture, you can see the blue is closing in on the red. And a little bit of gray here, this is Switzerland. The country remained neutral and was the only country not taken over by Nazi Germany during World War II. Go ahead and pause here if you need to finish taking these notes. And we'll move over to the Asian theater and talk about what was happening over in Asia. Because although Hitler had been defeated, Japan had not. The United States was able to take the countries of Iwo Jima and Okinawa through their island hopping strategy, but they suffered many casualties. This was not an easy feat at all. It was incredibly difficult. You've probably seen this photograph some point in your life. This is when the Marines were finally able to raise the American flag over the island of Okinawa after a horrible, hard-fought battle. In fact, I highly recommend the movie Hacksaw Ridge to see what the Battle of Okinawa was like. It's also a really beautiful, true story, and it is on Hulu if you have a Hulu subscription. So Hitler's been defeated. Several important islands that belong to the Japanese have been taken. But mainland Japan, the main island of Japan itself, has not been invaded. And now the United States faces a hard decision of what to do. Should they invade Japan and lose more American lives? Something else I want you to understand about the Japanese is they they were a force to be reckoned with. They were not kind to American prisoners of war. American prisoners of war were severely tortured when they were captured by the Japanese. So that's another thing to look at when you're sending your troops into enemy territory. This is also a vicious, vicious enemy who is not going to play fair to the men you send in there. So, side note, something that had been going on secretly during World War II is the Manhattan Project. Scientists in the United States were developing an atomic bomb. Now, the scientists were not necessarily all American. Albert Einstein is a Jew who escaped Germany, and they came up with this. It was tested out here in the desert of New Mexico, and so now Truman had a decision to make. Does he go with the invasion to try to take over Japan, or should he try out this new weapon? And no one even really knew how effective this new weapon was going to be. Truman he decides to go ahead and drop these bombs on Japan because he decides it's the best way to, even though either way, lives are going to be lost. If the United States does invade Japan, Japanese civilians and American soldiers are going to die. So he decides he's going to go ahead and try out these new weapons at the idea of saving American lives. The first bomb was dropped on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. 190,000 people were killed. Some were killed right away. I mean, the entire city was leveled. Some people literally just vanished into thin air. Their shadows are like emblazed on the sidewalks where they once stood. Some people died months later from radiation. In fact, effects of radiation for these people went on for decades after the bombs were dropped. Um, Japan did not surrender right away, so 3 days later, a second bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. Um, so then Japan agrees to unconditional surrender a little bit after that. So we see from August 6th to August 14th, it took almost 2 weeks for Japan to agree to unconditional surrender. And after Japan's surrender, World War II was finally over. 17 million people had died in battle over the course of World War II. About 20 million civilians had died as well. So that's 37 million people. The dropping of the atomic bomb also marked the beginning of the nuclear age. After the world had witnessed the deadly potential of nuclear energy, other countries raced to build their own nuclear weapons. In August 1949, the Soviet Union set off its first atomic bomb, which started an arms race with the United States that would last for the next 40 years. Go ahead and pause here if you need to finish these notes. Alright, so the war is over. Now, kind of like with what we saw with World War I, now we've got to decide what to do with this German territory. And now, I mean, gosh, German territory was almost all of Europe. So it's like, what do you do with Europe? Since France was one of the Allied powers, France still got to be normal France, so did Belgium. Switzerland never got involved, so Switzerland still gets to be Switzerland. Germany was divided into 4 sectors. So you can see this is how it's split up. This green area belongs to Great Britain. The blue belongs to France. The gold belongs to the United States. And the red belongs to the Soviet Union. They also divided up Berlin itself into 4 parts. So everyone owns a part of Berlin. If you've heard of the Berlin Wall, this is where the Berlin Wall ends up getting built to separate the Soviet Union in the east from the Allied powers, the rest of the Allied powers in the west. So they argued over what to do with Eastern Europe. Stalin wanted those countries to be friendly with the Soviet Union, who was now communist. He'd actually prefer them to be part of the Soviet Union and be friendly to communism. He felt it was important to have friendly neighbors that near him that were friendly to communism. Truman, who is now president of the United States after Roosevelt's death, he wanted those countries in Eastern Europe to have free elections and self-determination. We talked a lot about nationalism, and especially in that part of the world, that those countries, deserve the right to decide for themselves what kind of government they're going to have. But really, the United States wants them to be capitalist democracies like they are. Um, we always look at this from an American point of view because, we're Americans, but really both sides are doing the same thing. They're both the Soviet Union and the United States are telling these countries in Eastern Europe, you should be like me. Um, they're not really giving them self-determination because, what if those countries want to still have a king or What if they want to be like Greece and everyone gets a vote? I don't know. There's so many different ways you can set up your government, and no one's really giving these people or these countries the opportunity for self-determination. What they're really saying is, you should have a government that's just like my government, so I can show off how powerful I am and how many allies I have. After the end of the war, there were trials in Nuremberg, Germany for the Nazis who had committed crimes against humanity, war crimes. Um, so the Nuremberg trials, named after the city where they were held, um, these men were put on trial. The ones that hadn't escaped to South America, anyway. The League of Nations, obviously after World War One, had been unsuccessful. So after World War Two, the United Nations, or the UN, is founded. The UN is still a respected, successful organization that tries to bring help and world peace, and it's all about diplomacy, because obviously we haven't had another World War III. The United Nations has been working out for everyone so far. It's got its strengths, it's got its weaknesses, but that's a whole nother debate to get into, which we probably will farther in our last unit on contemporary issues. So this is how World War II ends. Go ahead and pause here if you need to finish up your notes. And we see how the ending of World War I is setting us up for our next unit on the Cold War. Thank you for listening, and I'll talk to you later.